You clicked on the video, you know what it is. Why am I doing it? Is it because I said, and this is a verbatim quote, if we reach 2,000 subscribers before the end of the year, I'll do a Marxist analysis of Sonic Adventure 1 and 2. Yes. Why would I say something like that? Because I didn't believe we'd get to 2,000 subscribers in that time. So congratulations everyone, you've got what you wanted. You get to make me do the classic, the secret Marxism of Space Jam video, which is an opportunity for a lot of fun, and also I never specified how much Marxism there'd be, so I'm going to take a lot of liberties with that. It's also made me think about what the value of the exercise is. What is the point of doing this? Because I want to honor my word, but also because there's something I observe that annoys me, and there's something about myself that I want to kind of clarify. I like to joke a lot, over and over, about how I'm not a strong reader. And maybe I'm not, maybe that's just true about me. But I would say this mostly as a kind of rebuff to the kind of person who gets really, it's time to eat your vegetables about reading theory, which to some people I'm sure is an appealing way to bring people on board. But for people who have a life, they fucking hate that shit. No one wants to eat your boiled vegetables or read all of the volumes of Capital. You got to at least fry the vegetables up a bit, make a sauce, add some fucking seasoning to it, and that's what this is. I do read theory sometimes. I just didn't make it my whole personality or talk about it all the time. Yeah, we have to eat our vegetables. It doesn't mean they have to taste bad. The thing that annoys me is that there are people, especially on the right, but not exclusively, who just don't know what the people they derive their ideology from actually said. I get that you can say, hey, this person is important, but I think this aspect of what they said or wrote was wrong because of X, Y, Z. That's healthy, actually, and it's good to critique even the foundational figures of your particular belief system. You could point out that for people on the right and who identify as part of the political center, that it doesn't matter what their ideological cornerstones actually said or did. How they define certain terms and what that means for how they view the world and what that implies about your worldview that you're deriving from them. That these people are just names they draw upon to signal to others that they're legit. If you said that to me, I'd say that you're probably right, but we should be better. We should actually be familiar with those things. We should hold ourselves to a higher standard and do it while having a bit of fun too. With that in mind, it's time to just set out some of the rules of how we're going to do this, because if I don't put limits on it, this video will be longer than any other video I've done, and I'm just not doing that. So here are the rules. I have to stick to the information presented in the two games as my source for any information I gather about the characters and the societies they inhabit. That means no comic books, no using Sonic X, which I believe covered the events of the games. The one exception is that if the characters say something that directly references past events depicted in a previous game or some other source, then I have to sort of acknowledge that just to keep it coherent. I'm allowed to extrapolate and make reasonable assumptions. For example, the fact that Station Square is clearly an urbanized area with a casino and a resort hotel means that it wouldn't be unreasonable for me to assume that the mode of production is probably capitalism, though I'll substantiate points like that in more detail when we get to it. I have to provide definitions where a term has a specific Marxist definition, and I'll do this by both having a definition on the screen where that makes sense and explaining myself the first time I use that definition. A good example would be if I used the term dictatorship of the proletariat, because you might assume that I mean like a centralized autocratic government that oppresses people. When Marx means dictatorship in a classical sense, a government that's brought in to achieve a specific goal. In this case, it's a government whose purpose is to manage the transition from capitalism to communism. My main reference points will be uncontroversially Marxist writers, mostly. There might be occasions where I just sort of step out of it, maybe, to provide a bit more background or to explain how someone else might look at a particular thing. That's not very likely, but I might, and I'll try to be as clear as possible when I do this, so you don't go around thinking I think some liberal theorist is a Marxist or something. We have to accept that doing this about a literal cartoon is at the very best an exercise in testing limits, and at worst virtually impossible, but I won't try to force an analysis too much. If something fits, it fits. If it doesn't, I'll try not to talk about it unless it's very, very funny, or I think I can kind of persuade you to my point. Let's just have fun and enjoy ourselves a little bit. I want to take the opportunity here just to answer a question that's going to come up. Do I believe Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 were written with Marxist intent? Who knows? I wasn't there, but my guess is no, and I'm not claiming it was written with that intent. It's just interesting to try to stretch something so thin that maybe you'll find something unintentionally interesting or hilarious. So with that in mind, everyone, I just want to say, if you're liking the video so far, if you're a return viewer and you haven't subscribed yet, just consider subscribing. I have a brand new goal for the year, which is to hit 5,000 subscribers, and I do finally have a thing for that, which is that if we hit 5,000 subscribers, I will do a video about how this was originally specifically about Commander Shepard, but I have expanded the scope a little bit to how every role-playing game protagonist in a game where morality is measured in some way and impacts gameplay is ultimately a centrist. So if you want to learn about that and delve into some game mechanic stuff, well, there's your cue to subscribe. Get me to 5k and we'll do it. But otherwise, let's just let's get started with it. How much longer I will never let go. God, I love that song. I love that song. Let's start with Sonic Adventure, or Sonic Adventure DX if you're me and you've only played it on GameCube. I'll probably call it Sonic Adventure 1 throughout just to distinguish it from 2. You play as 6 different characters: Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, Amy Rose, E102, Gamma, and Big the Cat, which, as you can tell from my face, is I was just thrilled about when as a kid. Each character has their own distinct gameplay style. Sonic runs fast, Tails also runs fast, but does it in a race against Sonic and then Eggman. Knuckles has to find the pieces of the shattered Mercer Emerald in one of the most frustrating styles of gameplay of all time in any game. Amy has to escape a robot that's chasing her or her little bird friend. E102 Gamma runs around doing like evil robot things and firing missiles off at targets that you lock onto. And my personal favorite, Big the Cat, just goes around fishing while looking for his friend Froggy. There ain't nothing wrong with that. The stories of these characters intersect and impact others. You see the same events play out from each character's perspective, and while that does cause some issues with the results of certain boss fights having to be ambiguous because the boss is one of the other player characters, I have to say it was a lot more ambitious than the story of a Sonic game had any right to be. I imagine they probably did this because adding the third dimension to games increases expectations narratively. That's not to say you can't have 2D games with interesting stories, just that a game being 3D does make me feel like there should be something more to it. The other thing a move to 3D does is it gives impetus to make the world at least feel a bit more, fleshed out in an explicit way. More on that in a sec. Merits of the gameplay and the ambition aside, the broad story is going to be one that, if you're my age, is going to be rather typical for a Sonic game. Eggman wants to build, either Robotnik Land or Eggman Land. I think it kind of depends on the game, which is a kind of hybrid city theme park that has Eggman's face all over it because the man is just an icon who loves himself and believes in his own genius to an extent that's almost admirable. Eggman has bound a being in this game called Chaos, who we'll talk about in more detail in a bit, to act on his behalf and needs to feed him Chaos Emeralds in order to get him to finally reach his final form. He also has his traditional collection of robots, or badniks as they're called, and yeah, I know my terminology in these games, which are powered by a critter that's been put inside them. I mean, maybe it's more like the Matrix where they're processors. I'm not really sure. But in any case, this all feels like a really inefficient way to make a robot, but the implication is that animals seem to have some essential quality that makes them suitable for this particular use. Through a series of contrivances, the Chaos Emeralds change hands and eventually end up inside Chaos, which I know sounds dirty, but believe me, it's not. All while Big tries to find Froggy, Knuckles does his thing, he gets tricked by Eggman. He's kind of a dumbass, you get it. And eventually Eggman is confronted on the Egg Carrier, alongside the creatively named Chaos 6, which is the final boss battle for the base game. Eggman eats shit, all is well, and after you go through everyone's story, you unlock the real final stage, which is fighting Final Chaos, and you defeat him by just sort of entering him at speed, which again, not what it sounds like. Then you savor your victory in the ruins of Station Square. It may seem like, based on that and the fact that, if we're being honest with each other, Sonic, Tails, Eggman, all of them are cartoon characters. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. Cartoon characters can have depth and be interesting. I mean, you'll just see how much I love Eggman as we go through this video, because he just kind of rocks, even if he's unambiguously the bad guy. Thanks to an innovation in Sonic Adventure, we actually have a surprising amount to go off. The transition to 3D didn't just mean that we got an attempt at a story with stakes and tension and characters and all of this stuff. We got the hub worlds, 3 of them. Station Square, the Mystic Ruins, and the Egg Carrier itself. These are how you access the missions, but they also tell us a little bit about the world in general, and about the capabilities and lifestyle of some of our characters. These hub worlds tell us so much, or at least give us the basis to make some assumptions. How they're connected, how they're organized, and in the case of one, who's in charge. What's presented in the game means we can make assumptions about how Station Square is organized economically, what the deal is with the Mystic Ruins. It also lets us figure out why those things make the fact that there's very clearly an efficient train service connecting Station Square and the Mystic Ruins so interesting. We can, and we will, use all these details in the hub worlds to inform how we do this. I also just kind of love the hub worlds as a concept. It's kind of a shame the second game didn't have them, and that the next time they were at a game was in Sonic 06. It's just kind of unfortunate for all involved. First though, we really need to crack Eggman to get to the bottom of this. Not just because we need to crack a few Eggmans to make an omelette, but also because after all these years, I need to finally understand what Eggman's deal is. To the casual observer, which would include me up until I did this video, Eggman is just your typical cartoon villain. What does he want to do? He wants to put animals into robots and then take over the world. Does this make sense? Could he have found another way to power his robots? Well, in Sonic Adventure 2, it's heavily implied he actually could have, but he makes for a great antagonist to the characters, who are themselves animals. The fast blue hedgehog has to liberate his critter friends from the egg-shaped bastard man who's trapping them in robots that attack him on sight. Sure, it works. There are no notes from me on that, frankly. However, in Sonic Adventure, we have a lot more information about the world and the relationships that we can assume exist because of that. Eggman isn't just some cottage industry roboticist. It's just not feasible for him to be that given the scale of the things he builds and the sheer amount of badniks we encounter. It's reasonable to say that Eggman has some manufacturing capacity, probably a factory or an assemblage. He also has access to the resources needed to fuel things like the egg carrier. I mean, look at it. Think about how much fuel that's going to need. To put it bluntly, Eggman has wealth. The question is, does he have capital? And it's easy to hear the term capital and just think it's the Scrooge McDuckian vaults that the rich have. Capital is wealth, yes, that exists when certain conditions are met. That there is a class of people who own the means of production as their property. We might refer to this as the bourgeoisie, perhaps. Might I suggest that there are productive forces that are the meeting of the means of production and labor. For example, a group of workers in a factory that turns plastics into rubber ducks, or I guess rubber into rubber ducks, I guess makes more sense. That is a productive force. These must be in a position to produce a surplus. I think it's hard to argue in the case of Eggman that he isn't producing surplus materials or just anything. Just look at how many badniks and weird boss battle robots he builds. How is this not a surplus? The final requirement is that this production and wealth be produced by a laboring class, which we might call the proletariat, that's free, in contrast to, for example, a serf who is technically owned by their landlord and tied to the land, or a slave who is chattel, that only have their labor to sell in exchange for a wage that they use to survive, and that are then alienated from what they produce. The clever among you will have spotted the problem. Eggman's laboring class is probably going to be his badniks, who are, at least from what we're shown, woodland critters that are placed inside robots and then do Eggman's bidding. So on the surface, it's easy to say that they aren't free, and therefore Eggman is not accumulating capital, isn't a capitalist, but is instead more like, like a Russian noble who owns serfs. The badniks aren't shown exercising choice during your gameplay. They just attack Sonic and friends seemingly at the request of Eggman, and we never really see anything from the perspective of the critters themselves, who are seemingly bound to the form that Eggman forces them into. However, the mystery is actually solved by examining Eggman's relationship with and the story of the most important character in the entire game, E102 Gamma. E102 Gamma has a critter inside him. E102 Gamma also has one of the most interesting narratives of the characters. He's the first evil or dark, or whatever you want to call him, character whose perspective we get to play through. And there's a lot of conflicting evidence I'd like to work through in order to work out whether Eggman has capital or just wealth. To summarize E102 Gamma's story, at some point before the story begins in the game, a bird is put inside this E100 series robot. Eggman commands the loyalty of Gamma and has him running errands until Gamma realizes, through interacting with Amy and the bird that follows her around, that maybe Eggman isn't a good guy. He just figured it out, folks. Eggman, not a good guy. Not a good guy at all. Gamma then rescues his comrades by destroying their robot prisons and releasing them, and finally does this with Beta, his brother. His final act in the story is to release himself from his robot prison joining Beta, and presumably they all go off to live happily ever after in the woods or wherever the fuck it is birds live. I don't know. I don't know enough about birds to verify that. Gamma's story has points in favor of the badniks of free laborers theory and some against it. So I'll take it sort of alternating one side at a time, and hopefully we can figure out what's going on here. So the first point in favor, Eggman has to incentivize Gamma to perform the training task a specific way. In the game, if you destroy enemies, Gamma's time limit to complete the mission extends, which we could write off as a game mechanic, but because Eggman says this explicitly, I think it is analogous to a kind of performance bonus, since Gamma can clearly choose to ignore certain targets. A point against would be we don't really see any of the other badniks display the level of autonomy that Gamma does. Most badniks seem to just blindly do as Eggman says, implying the critter inside is detached from any processing or decision making that their vessel conducts. But a pro is that there is a major exception to this, which is that we see Beta explicitly disobey Eggman's order that he be left behind when the egg carrier launches. That this happens early in Gamma's story isn't an accident. Him seeing that likely contributes to his openness to future betrayals of Eggman, and implies to me that to some extent the badnik's servitude towards Eggman is a choice. Another point against, the fact that Gamma has to rescue his comrades by blowing them up, and that they fight back while then accepting their freedom, suggests that they were held in the robot bodies that Eggman forced them into, and that the decision making was made by something other than the critter inside. Presumably the robot itself, relegating the critter to power supply or processing or whatever you want to think. Despite this, even if the robot component is in charge of decision making, Gamma voluntarily destroys himself in order to free the critter, and through the story sympathizes with, and you might say gains consciousness through this, but he sympathizes with the heroes, and those being oppressed by Eggman, which if nothing else narratively suits the whole thing I'm doing, so I'm inclined to say yes to it. However, even if we accept that the robots or the critters inside them or some combined intelligence are able to make decisions, there is one critical flaw. We never see Eggman pay a wage to any of his badniks. We might argue that the rings that Gamma collects is some kind of currency, since they're paid out by the machines in the casino, and, look at that vault. That's clearly a vault for money. But who puts the rings there? Eggman? Is he also Sonic's employer because he makes Sonic pick up the rings for some reason? The counter to that is the critters inside the badniks are clearly alive whenever you free them. So they're clearly getting what they need to live via some mechanism. Now that's not unique to wage labor. It could be like feeding your slaves, just enough to keep them alive. Perhaps they get some kind of company cash that allows them to get food and water from the machine that imprisons them. I don't know. I don't think that any of these points on either side are too much of a stretch. I genuinely think it could go either way. The moment I can't get out of my head, though, is Beta standing up to Eggman. That's our biggest indication that there's more to the badniks than meets the eyes. Is it a lot to go off? No, but it's such a great instigating incident in Gamma's gradual rejection and elevated consciousness that he develops through the story. That is to say that he gains class consciousness, an awareness of his place within the system that Eggman has placed him within, and in the story he develops this through interaction with primarily Amy, who affirms and instills a shared humanity, which is a bit of a weird term because we're talking about a hedgehog lady and a robot, but bear with me. She instills that within Gamma, who upon cultivating this consciousness decides that he needs to liberate his fellow oppressed workers, the E100 series of robots. With Eggman's position as a member of the bourgeoisie established, and the badniks through Gamma and Beta established as a laboring class, specifically being oppressed by Eggman, why would Eggman want to destroy Station Square and replace it? Station Square is pretty plainly existing within a capitalist society. I mean, they have cops, for one. Is it the case that Station Square, or the state that it's subordinate to, is supporting factions of capital that are opposed to Eggman? That's tricky. Eggman appears to own Casinopolis. I mean, I find it hard to explain why the slot machines have his face on them, and we know he loves to put his face on things, so maybe he owns the slot machine or something, but I don't know. Like, does he produce the slot machine itself in the sort of pinball machine? Though I will say, my partner, when she read this section, decided that the explanation is just that, like, Eggman is popular. Though, actually, now I think about it a bit more, it might just be that Sonic and his friends, and therefore his enemies, are just the subject of a lot of pop culture in that universe. Who knows? I can't shake this idea that Eggman definitely owns the casino. I think it's a combination of a massively inflated ego, that the accumulation of capital has become essential to his character, that he has entered the spiral of accumulation and has been trapped by capital to his detriment, compelling him to greater and greater extremes in his pursuit of accumulation, hence the plan to destroy Station Square and use his workforce and means of production to build something new, presumably with the benefit of excluding the other factions of capital already present. If that is the core of the plot, then the question occurs, why stop him? The simplest explanation is, his plan is fucking nuts and will kill thousands of people, which, fair, that is true. To get a sense of some of the additional motivations going on in the story, we need to look at the second most important character in this story, Knuckles, and one of the antagonists, Chaos, and the whole thing that's happening with the echidnas in this game. Throughout the game, each of the player characters are visited by Tikal, who shows them part of the events that led to the downfall of the Echidna civilization, in order to guide them to preventing a cataclysm that will befall them if Chaos is allowed to enter his final form, which I feel stupid saying every time, but it is nonetheless the way the game works. This is also the civilization that's responsible for the Mystic Ruins, where Tails maintains a workshop, as well as presumably being responsible for Angel Island, the floating home of the Master Emerald, and Knuckles. If you look at the architecture and the dress sense of the echidnas and the climate of the Mystic Ruins in the modern day, a sort of overgrown jungle biome with mountains, the echidnas in the game are clearly supposed to invoke the image of indigenous Mesoamericans with those stepped pyramids. I think it's reasonable to say that it's meant to be the Aztecs. I know that many cultures across the world had stepped pyramids, and no, I am not about to go on an ancient aliens tangent before anyone gets worried. I just want to say that I'm aware of this, and that the most prominent and well-known of the civilizations that made these stepped pyramids was the Aztecs. I mean, okay, Egypt also had stepped pyramids, but if we're being honest with each other, they're more famous for their later work, and fair enough, that shit is fucking impressive. Knuckles is the only remaining descendant of the Knuckles clan, and he takes his role seriously. I mean, he is a bit of a himbo and has a track record of being tricked by the most obvious liar in the series, but he takes his duty seriously enough to put the player through the most tedious form of gameplay in both Sonic Adventure games, searching far and wide to find the pieces of the Master Emerald, which I just thinking about it exhausts me. I hated it so much as a kid. There are certain implications with Knuckles being tricked by Eggman, Eggman's status as a capitalist, and Eggman's use of Chaos, who resided within the Master Emerald, as well as the fact that And I'm sorry, maybe this is just because I live in Britain and this kind of infrastructure is beyond our wildest dreams, but there's a direct train from Station Square to the Mystic Ruins, and no one seems to pay for it at any point. Like, come on, like when are we gonna get around to doing this here? Back to the actual game. Chaos is the guardian of the Chao, those adorable little blue guys who we'll definitely be talking about later on. They seem to be a known thing in the world, with movie franchises advertised on hoardings in both Sonic Adventure 1 and 2. They had a temple among the echidnas, which suggests a degree of importance, and the fact that Takal is the only one we see that Chaos allows to approach them speaks to there at least being a cultural connection between the Chao and the echidnas, but that this connection is not necessarily totally positive. Nonetheless, I don't think it's controversial to suggest that they're important to this indigenous echidna culture. Their indigeneity raises questions about Station Square's relationship with the Mystic Ruins, especially with that train connecting them. I mean, I know trains can go across borders, but I would hazard a guess that Station Square and the Mystic Ruins are in the same political division, country, state, whatever you want to call it, which would put Station Square as a place within something like, just going off aesthetics alone, America. Like, it screams America to me, even though the Aztecs were in Mexico, but it's like close enough. It's a game, you know. It's a game. You can have a bit of license with it. I mean, thank the Mexican American War for them being close enough, I guess. And before anyone gets cute, I do know the Mississippian culture built mounds, and they are kind of technically pyramids, but come on, they don't have the aesthetics, they don't have the vibes. Let's be real. This would put whatever polity Station Square belongs to as a settler colony, a society that destroys the indigenous way of life and replaces it with the colonizers' social relations and economic models. That Knuckles is the last of his people, or at least the only one that we see in the modern day of the game, and the implications of a Knuckles clan is that there were other echidna societies, suggests that this mode of existence has been eliminated. Which, incidentally, means the chief of the Knuckles clan, who wanted to take over the world through warmongering, using the justification that he wanted to save his people, well, it means he may have been kind of right about that. I mean, you can't really do preemptive conquest. This isn't EU4, but, like, he was kind of right about it. While Takal, the pacifist, opposes her father, and in the plot twist we all saw coming, the real destruction was the pursuit of warmongering and Chaos just using the Chaos Emeralds to destroy the Knuckles clan, which, you know, you have an immortal water god hanging around, don't give him the infinite power stones, I guess. The other implication of this is that Eggman is aware of this cultural history, and he exploits it. He exploits the fact that Knuckles, his people, his culture have been the victim of this process to get him to act against his friends. It's easy given how often Eggman tricks Knuckles in, you know, like across Sonic media, but particularly Sonic X and in other games, as well as just the general depiction of him that's developed over time. It is easy to write Knuckles off as just a himbo, a dumbass, or whatever, but at least within the confines of Sonic Adventure, that is oversimplifying it a little too much. I'm not saying he's like a titan of intellectualism, or that he's not a buff, dumb, vaguely nice guy. He is, but he also clearly takes his duty seriously and has some manner of connection to his indigenous heritage, protecting an artifact that contains an immortal deity relevant to that culture, even if that connection and devotion is a product of him just kind of not thinking about it. I still think it matters and is significant. If he is the last, or one of the last of his people who adhere to that legacy, you can see how Eggman's cynical weaponization of it would work, especially if he's just kind of a dumbass, as I keep saying. I'm sorry to any Knuckles fans out there, it's just kind of true, let's be real. This might feel familiar to us. To bring it to the real world, this resembles the co-opting of various marginalized people's struggles for the benefit of capitalist ends, struggles that have often come about because of and in opposition to capitalism and the social reproduction of it. I wonder, in light of this, what is the deal with the anthropomorphized animals in this setting? They live alongside humans to various extents, like Big can just catch the train into Station Square to try to find Froggy, despite him living in the swamp. And Sonic seems to spend his spare time chilling at a resort. Big and Knuckles seem more keen to live apart from that world, but Sonic, Tails, and Amy seem to be well integrated within it, even if Tails spends his time at his workshop being a nerd. That's just facts, I'm sorry. I want to propose a thought that the anthropomorphized animals are the various descendants of indigenous societies and peoples. If Gamma, in the form of a critter captured by Eggman, is more representative of the process of proletarianization, then the others represent the various victims of the expansion of the capitalist mode of production through colonialism, persisting in and saving that same system. If we accept this, it changes the tenor of the whole story. Instead of we're saving the world because that's what we do, we're heroes, which is the story of a cartoon. We have a series of stories defined by complicated relationships to the dominant mode of production, represented through the people of Station Square, themselves largely workers who will be killed by Eggman's plan, and Eggman himself. Big just wants to find his frog friend and go home. Knuckles wants to recover the historic artifact of his culture and return to being the guardian of that legacy. Tails wants to both defeat Eggman and get out of Sonic's shadow and be a true equal partner with him. Amy wants to save the critter who's with her because she knows the likely fate that awaits him, a lifetime of wage labor, exploitation, and alienation. Sonic wants to stop Eggman from destroying Station Square because, yeah, that's what he does. But because, and we know this from him freeing the critters at the end of the level, he knows what Eggman is and what he represents and why he must be stopped. Speaking of which, let's just sort of do a bit of a summary here. Eggman is defeated in the story, but it wouldn't be a 3D Sonic game without a climactic final battle where a totally legally distinct state called Super Sonic happens because Sonic gets the Chaos Emeralds and fights the big bad real boss, in this case Final Chaos, which despite Tails saying all's well that ends well at the end of this, does destroy Station Square. Like, thousands are dead. Even more are displaced. Sure, Tails, I'm sure it's fine, buddy. It's fine. Don't worry about it. So Eggman is stopped in the sense that he's not going to get to build Robotnik Land, but he does achieve 50% of what he wants. This will not be the last time he does 50% of a job and then doesn't stick the landing. Chaos, as an immortal deity who existed alongside an indigenous culture whose role was to protect a creature important to that culture, is arguably taking retribution upon a way of life that destroyed the way of life he was connected to. Sonic's intervention as Super Sonic stops Chaos from destroying basically everywhere in the world. The outcome that Takal was trying to guide the characters away from, successfully, if a little bit late. At least for the residents of Station Square, who I will remind you, thousands are dead. It's actually kind of odd how little the death and destruction in Station Square is remarked upon. Yeah, it's the end of the game, but come on, you think you just like have a moment, right? Station Square doesn't, at least to my knowledge, appear in any later mainline Sonic game. but we can assume that it rebuilds and that it rebuilds according to the status quo that existed before. That is, that it's much the same city as it was before. The only mention of it is in Sonic Adventure 2, I think, when Tails reveals that he was given a Chaos Emerald as a reward for saving the city, which did you save the city? I'm not sure, but it implies heavily that the same fundamental governing structure existed after the incident with Perfect Chaos, Final Chaos. I've forgotten what I've called him now. It's late. A real missed opportunity, one might say, but also a reflection on how durable the existing structures are and how wide they must be. Station Square is clearly not a city-state, because otherwise how would they not at least change something if an immortal Mesoamerican water god came and destroyed the city? You'd at least, rethink a couple of things. Chaos is ultimately soothed from his use of the negative energy of the Chaos Emeralds through Supersonic's intervention and Takal showing him that in fact the Chao are, they're alright, they're fine. Even though, as we'll discuss later, I'm not convinced they are fine. I'm not sure about that, actually. The story of this game is both wider, but in my opinion a bit weaker than Sonic Adventure 2. The hub worlds gave us a lot to work off. This is my speculation, but I think the fact that this was the first 3D Sonic game to try this sort of weaving multi-character story, it maybe suffered a little from that. The ending is essentially, and then Chaos went back to his home planet. Which, fine. I mean, why did he do that? Who knows? Sonic beat him up and the cute critters are fine, actually. Again, this is whatever, right? But this is how you can tell that there wasn't a particular intent with the story, at least in the way that we're analyzing it, besides, we need a heroic narrative, and that's fine. The vengeful spirit is soothed by a small victory, the preservation of ecology important to it, and the culture that venerated it. Capitalism remains a snake that eats itself, with Eggman at least getting the satisfaction of destroying the capital of the capitalist that he's opposed to, as well as his own casino. Maybe he's going to get some insurance money out of that. I don't know. And the heroes get to be heroes, albeit to a system that oppresses and loathes them and others. But now we get to talk about the real stars of the show. Rolling around at the speed of sound. There were cops driving by, which is why I have the song in my head. But yeah, there you go. Sonic Adventure 2. What a game. I can't even do the whole I'm taking my nostalgia glasses off. It's impossible. The soundtrack is a banger. I'm not even just talking about City Escape, which I was just singing, or Live and Learn. I mean, even down to the music for the individual levels that you don't remember. I mean, it's just so good. Just straight bangers up and down, and it's clearly the best 3D Sonic could have been. The gameplay is just fun enough, and the story is just, well, you'll see, but it just works, and that's without me adding the layer onto it that I will. Before we get into the meat here, I want to say that these two games are clearly continuous with each other. It's clearly an intent there. They're not set in different universes or anything like that, which means that up to the events of the game, my analysis of any returning characters who play a role in both stories will be the same. Eggman, Knuckles, Sonic, Tails, they're all starting out in approximately the same position, but things develop. In fact, in Eggman's case, they escalate hilariously. In Sonic Adventure 2, instead of 6 different characters with their own individual storyline that you play through in one go just as that character, our player characters are split into 2 distinct storylines, the hero storyline and the dark storyline. Yeah, it's not subtle about what you should think about these characters. I would argue, though, that makes things both easier for me and for the devs, because by having each hero paired up with an obvious foil, it simplifies writing, and having only 3 distinct forms of gameplay means you don't have to recycle levels and design so much. I think Sonic Adventure 2 is a better game and presents interesting things about the world while having a different way of delivering that to you. The hub worlds are gone, And that means more work has to go into cutscenes and sort of connecting narrative, and it pays off both for the game and for our exercise here. By pairing Tails with Eggman, Knuckles and Rouge, Sonic with Shadow, it really simplifies the way this plays out in our analysis. It means there might be a lot less Marxism at least. It's also interesting that they took the concept they had in Sonic Adventure with Gamma and decided, well, let them just play as Eggman. It really was one of the first games I remember where you play as like the explicit narrative antagonist. In fact, you play as a team of the antagonists. The characters with the most stability in who they are and what force they're opposed to is Knuckles, where he was probably the second most important player character in Sonic Adventure 1. He's much less fundamentally interesting here. Rouge, a jewel thief, is trying to take the Master Emerald from him, seemingly by just walking up and asking him, which, I'm going to be real with you all, it doesn't seem like a good plan. Knuckles, of course, says, no, what are you... No, get out of here. And when Eggman shows up, rather than let this colonizer take the emerald, he destroys it. Rouge has this quality to her that's a little more interesting, which is that she's not really aligned to Eggman and to Shadow. She's just a government spy who's collecting intel and engaging in her side hustle, which is stealing treasure. Now, I'm going to be open about this. If she was stealing from the British Museum, it would still be a little distasteful if her intent wasn't to give it back to the people that the artifact was probably stolen from. It's really distasteful that she's trying to steal this obviously important thing in front of Knuckles and doing it just by like walking up and like, hey man, can I have that? It's nice. Eggman swooping in to steal it and her interest in just getting him worked up enough that he lets her take it somehow, I think that's her plan, just reads as the same things we've talked about before. Colonialism, the destruction and pillaging of the indigenous way of life, and the things that they build and the things that they place value in. In a way, you could only write this sort of character as a foil to Knuckles, a government spy, presumably for the government that enforces the property rights of capitalists and historically of the colonists and this particular person who has taken up pillaging as a hobby. It can't really be much more on the nose. A literal government agent, presumably from the same political entity that Station Square is in, especially if we take the super San Francisco vibes of the city and City Escape, which means that we're putting it in somewhere like America. It just makes sense that she'd have no respect for Knuckles until forced to out of gratitude for saving her life. And even then, you don't really get the sense that she's changed her outlook very much. One thing I will say is that Rouge's levels do at least have some variety in terms of what she's looking for, and her story does have a level of complexity with her double agent status that makes her decisions have more nuance, more weight. Is she genuinely turning her back on the government that let her loose? Does she really care about Shadow when he falls to the earth? And what is it she's planning to do with her life after? I'm going to be real with you all, it's probably more theft. It's probably more theft. That girl loves stealing. Eggman is paired off against Tails. Eggman is still up to his usual antics, although this time he's taking residence in a pyramid. A non-stepped pyramid, I should point out. This is clearly Egypt. Which seems like he's downscaled his operation from the literal Star Destroyer ripoff he was flying around in. His array of badniks still have the animals within them, and he even reuses some designs with some suspiciously Gamma-like robots wandering around. And if these are like Gamma, we should remember that they're there in exchange for a wage, or at least some kind of sustenance. Eggman has kind of given up on the capitalist gain here, instead deciding to descend into weird personal stuff with breaking into a military base to see what his grandfather's secret weapon was. And, well, look, there's no other way to say it, so I'm gonna let him make his announcement himself. Yeah, he blows up half the moon to intimidate the world's government into surrendering control to him. Is this one of those things that Marx considered in detail? Well, no, not blowing up the moon, but I certainly that capitalism and capitalists who seek profit degrade the environment in order to make that profit, or are willing to degrade it to a significant extent. And I would say that blowing up half the moon is an extreme act of environmental degradation. I mean, the effect on the tides alone, right? Eggman in both games exists in pretty stark contrast to Tails. When I was writing this, I was joking to my partner about Eggman being an artisanal robot builder. When I was still weighing up whether to work the Eggman as a capitalist angle, I would make this joke with her. Tails does seem to just be in it for the love of the game. His workshop in Sonic Adventure 1 and the fact that Tails does seem to put in all of the work himself puts him in contrast to Eggman. You could argue that the only reason there isn't a Tails carrier, or that he only really goes around in, his plain mech hybrid, is because Tails simply doesn't care to do that because he's not angling for world domination. And that is reasonable. I get it. Tails just seems to be a nice lad, and nice lads do not put woodland critters into robots. Beginning to wish someone had told Eggman that when he was a child. The Tails-Eggman dichotomy is pretty clear when you see the difference in how they treat their respective Chaos Emeralds. Tails uses his Chaos Emerald to try to find Eggman in order to thwart him, and Eggman uses his to blow up the moon. Which, we're gonna have to live with it. In Sonic Adventure 1, he also innocently uses it to make his plane go super fast, and look, he's not perfect, but he's allowed to have a bit of fun, isn't he? Knuckles and Tails are the less interesting characters in this game. Tails has had his moment where he grows out of Sonic's shadow in the previous games, which is why he can stand up to Eggman on his own, and does. Knuckles is stuck in his previous role, which we've already explored. The really interesting character whose relationship to the forces of the society they live in changes is Sonic. The Sonic Shadow rivalry could be boiled down to cocky, extreme 90s style character meets his inevitable 2000s edgy kind of goth replacement. Especially because Sonic isn't really that interesting in the first game. He's more of an irresistible force that makes things happen, while all of these interesting societal forces kind of battle out around him. Don't get me wrong, he's a big deal and important, but that's not necessarily interesting in this framework. I deliberately didn't talk about possibly the one thing about Sonic in the first game that may have been interesting and relevant. The first time you play as him, the first time you see him, he's rushing to the aid of cops trying to take down Chaos. Now, part of the reason I didn't mention this is because I didn't want to say the line, Sonic is a cop, because, and you'll have to pardon me for saying it like this, it is a cop-out. Sonic doesn't know anything about Chaos. He doesn't know why the police are attacking him. Fuck, I bet the police don't know why they were attacking him. If they could think like that, they wouldn't be police. Sonic literally says, this'll be fun, and while I do think at least some portion of police get personal pleasure from inflicting pain, Sonic's like a child. I'm pretty sure he's like 12. It's entirely possible he is just like having fun. This is what he does. That being said, it is interesting that the police just let him deal with it, such as the privilege of being a hero, I suppose, but it also speaks to a relationship with law enforcement and the state. Sonic coexists with the existing order. I mean, he certainly seems to enjoy it when he's lounging at a resort. Think of the contrast when we first see Sonic in Sonic Adventure 1, rushing to the aid of the police, and when we see him in Sonic Adventure 2, escaping from a military vehicle and jumping off it into one of the best levels in the game, probably one of the best opening levels of a game ever. In Sonic Adventure, Sonic only really fights against the Badniks and Eggman. In this game, especially in some of the levels, he's escaping and fighting against Gun, which is also who Eggman is fighting against to bust Shadow out. Sonic and Shadow's first bosses are these weird and easy to beat mechs. They have to routinely fight their way through hordes of the sort of mediocre robots sent out by Gun. They also firmly believe in their own superiority over the other whenever they talk to each other, and they're motivated by a deep connection to their friends and their family. There's even something, I think, that adds to one of the ideas I had before. The reason Gun goes after Sonic and arrests him multiple times, which, by the way, seems unlikely given how fast he can run unless Sonic is allowing himself to be arrested, is because of them mistaking Shadow for Sonic in a way too on-the-nose moment, given how often this happens to people from minority backgrounds in the UK. The media in the game mistake Shadow for Sonic. You might think that analogy is a stretch, but if we did consider the anthropomorphized hedgehogs as remnants of indigenous cultures and peoples, it is interesting that the press would mistake these two when they look totally different. I mean, Shadow has the official goth color scheme. Now, the core of Shadow's story, which in this game is probably the most important one, is his desire to pursue revenge on behalf of Maria, who was Gerald Robotnik's granddaughter, I've completely forgotten, so forgive me there. Incidentally, that is Gerald's face on the space laser that blows up half the moon. I guess that's a family tradition to put your face on everything. Also, if you're doing space colonization, you're definitely a capitalist. Like, I did a video about that, but like, I'm not apologizing for that position. It's 100% what's happening. It turns out that after Eggman is defeated again, and the traditional pattern of Eggman unleashing something that will fuck everyone, in this case the space colony Ark falling to Earth, it also turns out that the family trait is trying to create the ultimate life form, and Sonic and Shadow have to go Super Saiyan, Super Sonic and Super Shadow. Completely legally distinct, I promise, in order to defeat the final hazard. With all this going on, Shadow realizes that what Maria actually wanted wasn't revenge, but for him to make humanity happy. Everything he does for the joy of the people. Which, you know, not being dead does tend to make a significant portion of people happy. So good job, Shadow. You nailed it, buddy. Also, God, the music for that final boss goes so hard. Live and Learn is a straight banger. Honestly, I have no real notes for this final boss or the ending. The fact that Shadow's sacrifice seems to allow everyone a moment on an individual level to just set aside their bullshit is nice. If they'd stopped making Sonic games here, it would have been a totally worthy ending. Though in terms of how we're looking at it, the fact that Gerald produced a creature whose sole purpose was to destroy the Earth out of personal pettiness is really just beyond my comprehension. I mean, talk about a contingency plan. This is where It's a Cartoon really scuppers any attempt to examine it in that way. It gets way too big, too ridiculous, and sometimes you do have to just enjoy it for what it is. But, we're not just going to do that. In any case, we see a lot of the same structures at play as we did in the first one. Sonic gets into some trouble, the heroes have to go out of their way to undo the damage done by one of Eggman's classic schemes, the villains and heroes have to race against each other to collect Chaos Emeralds, all this while the government, or a coalition of governments, since Gun, well, we'll get there, but Gun seems like it's international, is trying to interfere in all this and are probably making it worse. Let's talk about those governments now in Sonic Adventure 2. There are two main branches of a government that we're alerted to in this game. The first is there's a president who apparently needs to be told that Eggman is a national crisis, which, I don't know, it seems kind of obvious, you know, like considering that he blew up half the moon, that does seem like an understatement to me. Also, the president is interrupted by Sonic, who cuts off his negotiations with Eggman, and negotiations is a generous term for what's happening there. Like, the guy just feels a little powerless, and if that isn't just the vibe with presidents these days, Eggman wants to subsume his nation and presumably all the others into his new Eggman Empire, which leads to the incredible line from Sonic later on about kicking their imperial butts while also loudly declaring that he has no idea what the space colony bit of this is about. He's just like, I don't know. Who knows? Which is actually just really charming, and it does make you think that perhaps Sonic's encounter with the state and the state's violence has changed his outlook, but let's be honest, Sonic just lives to embarrass Eggman. Any incidental anti-imperialism and destroying cops or imperialist military hardware is a bonus, and one that I enjoy greatly. The core and important fact here is, look how powerless the state is in this game. The president is basically going to surrender to Eggman until the heroes intervene, and that's before we get to how powerless and ineffective Gun is. Let's think a little about the state. The fact that there is clearly a bourgeois state, one that acts in the interests of the bourgeois and maintains their property rights. Think about this. What was Chaos's actual crime in Sonic Adventure 1? At most, it's being a weird slime monster in public, which if that's a crime, you better lock me up for it, I guess. But it's more likely to be property damage. So the state operates above society and sets the boundaries of society. For example, when Shadow steals a Chaos Emerald, that's a crime, or is something that will bring disorder, which requires being taken to Guantanamo. I mean, it's hard to read what's happening to Sonic at the start of the story as anything other than an extraordinary rendition, especially when they send him to an island prison where he appears to be in isolation, which makes it kind of hard to place Gun. Instinctively, it feels like military police, and I don't mean like militarized police like the NYPD. Yet there does seem to be something international about its operations and its reach, and let's be honest, the fact that it clearly has insanely high-tech hardware compared to, like, the Station Square PD. In fact, and this is partially related to the next section, when you destroy a gun, vehicle, or robot, you're actually rewarded with a Chaos Drive, which seems to fulfill the essential purpose that the woodland critters do in Eggman's robots and in the Chao Garden in order to boost their stats, which implies there is something essential going on, which to me also kind of proves that Eggman is engaging in a process that changes the critters fundamentally by imposing a set of relations onto them, like he's trying to build something for himself. Whereas Gun has taken this path which changes nothing about anyone. They're not seeking to upend an existing order, but seek to preserve it, whereas Eggman wants to be the big guy. And there are some interesting potential thoughts that emerge from this. One is that Eggman is living the capitalist dream, and I don't mean that he's in a position to monopolize all of the world's capital and political power, which is perhaps not the ambition of a typical capitalist, at least in terms of political power, because when you're in charge and there is no other person to hold accountable and everything goes wrong, there's only really one person to blame, hence, you know, the bourgeois state and electoral politics as pressure valves and institutions to blame for the excesses of the bourgeoisie. What I mean is he's clearly more powerful than the state at points of this story. Like, Gun look feeble compared to Sonic and Shadow. Never mind the fucking Death Star that he acquires later. No individual can ever really be more powerful than the state. It simply operates too far above society, commands too many resources, and typically has a monopoly on violence. That's why when you look at revolutionary socialist thought, they tend not to rely on a guy with, like, a giant space laser to get things done, but a revolution of the proletariat as a class, usually a violent one, because the bourgeois state will deploy violence to preserve itself. Now, in a world with lightning-fast hedgehogs and immortal water gods and egg-shaped scientists with Death Stars, things do get a bit complicated, and it does upend a few considerations. Turns out mad scientists can overpower the state. Given Sonic's arrest record, I think it's fair to say that the state can kind of contain him if they want. But even so, Eggman does require a literal Death Star with his granddad's face on it to overwhelm the state as an individual. Of course, Eggman fails because he's a loser, and even sides with the heroes, though I would suggest this is more out of his own self-interest in not dying, which opens the door to a lot of commentary about capitalists struggling with the concept of their own mortality recently, but that will have to wait for another video. Maybe coming soon, who knows. Regardless, Eggman isn't redeemed in his actions. He spends his time in the credit scene more on contemplation than anything. I actually really enjoy these moments in the credit scenes. It feels like a satisfying close to various player characters having a brief moment with their respective foils. It's sweet, and it kind of emphasizes that it's a cartoon, and that sort of thing. The story is wrapped up in a neat bow that we could only ever dream of in our own struggles. The noted exception is Sonic, who signs off with the line "Sayonara Shadow the Hedgehog," which feels like the place to leave this section. None of the tensions are really explicitly resolved, because this is a story revolving around individuals operating within society. Once Sonic delivers that final line, we're left to imagine the directions that the characters might go in. Hanging on the edge of tomorrow. Okay, my singing is terrible. I need to I don't know if I'll include like the bits of me singing before I turn on the teleprompter, but like, it's not good. Okay, so I've kind of talked around probably the biggest part of both games. The Chao Garden. I sank so many hours into the Chao Garden as a kid. It's not even funny. I remember there used to be websites about how to get specific types of Chao. And if those sites still exist, I will throw screenshots up on the screen. Otherwise, if you're seeing my face, they probably don't exist or I've forgotten them. But let me tell you, the Chao Garden absolutely prepared me for playing Crusader Kings 3, because there were layers to the eugenics you had to do in that game, that mini game. Considering how much of a time sink it is, it'd be a pretty big omission on my part to not bring it up and try to figure out what's going on here. The Chao Garden appears in both games, and it appears to exist separately from the main storyline. What is it trying to say? Or B, is it just a cute little virtual pet side game? I mean, yeah, that's clearly what it is and what it's intended to be, but doesn't that make some aspects of it maybe a little odd? So, what is the Chao Garden? It's a side game that you can access in both games where you raise the titular Chao, who are pretty important to the story of the first game, since Chaos is a deity of the Chao, and their continued safety is a precondition for calming him the fuck down. In the first game, it's pretty much straight up a pet raising game. I don't think they had many of the like add-ons that you get later on. It's also less alarming in the first game that every single player character has access to the Chao Garden, given that all of the player characters in Sonic Adventure 1 aren't specifically coded to be evil. If it was just this simple form of Chao Garden as a kind of adorable pet game, I could still see how people would sink 1,000 hours into it, but I'd be considerably less interested in it, and it would be less interesting. In Sonic Adventure 2, the same basic premise exists, but because there's no hub world to access your Chao Garden, you have to find keys in the levels or by using the level selector once you've unlocked it. However, every single character has access to the same shared pool of gardens, and you can unlock a hero garden and a dark garden alongside it, which raises questions like, can the Chao be evil? And I guess the answer is yes. And have you considered that Chao can have bad vibes and are not fun to be around? Those bad vibes kind of make the bit where you can send your Chao off to school and you can enter them into races and karate tournaments a bit weird. Look, I know this is basically the take that everyone has when they think about the premise of Pokemon for like 5 minutes. But are people doing illegal fighting and racing with the Chao? Are all of the characters such scumbags that they take these like timeless creatures who hold a special place in an indigenous culture and just make them race for their amusement? Even Knuckles? I mean, sure, but I guess that's why it exists separate from everything in its own pocket universe. I don't know, there wasn't really a grand narrative for this bit. I just knew that if I didn't mention the Chao Garden, the question would be asked. And to be honest, if you want to know how it looks at a basic level, it just looks like exploitation of nature. Racing horses can be beloved by their owners. That doesn't change the fact that they go to the glue factory at the end of the day. Which, incidentally, Chao don't die, or at least they don't have to, as long as you don't abuse them, which apparently is an option they left open, which is really dark if you think about it for too long. they endlessly seem to resurrect themselves if they're treated nicely, which does raise the question, were the Chao shown to Chaos at the end of Sonic Adventure literally the same Chao he was protecting all that time ago? If they were, that's a really neat way to tie up that loose end. I guess as a positive note to end this bit of the video, that's a heartwarming thought that they were taken care of for long enough through the centuries to be reunited with their original protector. You know, also shout out to Gamma, the true working class hero of the games. So there you go, we're going to try and wrap it up now. I think by way of a conclusion, I just want to repeat that I don't really believe there was a Marxist intent in the writing here, but that's just kind of the fun of putting something out there. People get to interpret, and the writers will have been influenced by so many things that they may not even recognize it. Really, this was just a bit of fun. Thank you all for 2K subscribers. Like, just thank you all again. I am so grateful to reach even that modest number, and at this point I just want to say it would have been really easy for me to do bits about like the highways having loop-de-loops in them and what that says about the infrastructure and all of this stuff. I think I resisted it for long enough, so you know, well done. Everyone say well done SK in the comments for taking it seriously enough to not do that at all. With that in mind, I need to thank my proofreader, who is my partner. She really had a lot of patience with this one, and really, as someone who is not a Marxist, really helped me sort of make this as accessible as possible. So thank you to her. I also need to thank Molto, who made the thumbnail for this one. You know, it's a really, really good thumbnail. I gave her a very specific brief, and she fucking smashed it. So go check her out in the link below. She has a Ko-fi. You can commission her. Go commission her. Go. Do it right now. I also need to thank the patrons and members of the channel, particularly the top tier patrons, Drone Riff, Mercutio, Kurzi, Shida, John N, and Liron. Special thank you to them, and a special thank you to the YouTube members Nadir Jiwa and Katie Marshall. I also need to say, everyone, if you enjoyed the video, remember to like, comment, subscribe, share the video, tell all your friends about the video, do all of that good stuff. And I want to remind you all that if we hit 5,000 subscribers before the end of the year, I think I forgot to say that at the start, but if we do it before the end of the year, and this is the bit I will show everyone, if they call me out on it, I will do a video where I essentially call Commander Shepard a centrist, because he is a centrist. So yeah, if you want to see me get into beef with a fictional character I've not thought about in probably the best part of a decade and a half, not even a decade and a half, but like more than a decade, yeah, just subscribe, and then you'll see me like really get into it and really, really lay into Commander Shepard and BioWare. So, you know, what have you got to lose? Go do that, and also go join the Patreon if you fancy doing that sort of thing. But with that, everyone, I am away to go start beef with an entirely different figure to Commander Shepard. Take it easy, everyone. I'll catch you all on the next one. Oh, also, I hope that I have enlarged, one might say inflated, your knowledge of Sonic the Hedgehog. So if you would like to learn more, do Google Sonic inflation,